Welcome to Rich Planet TV. I'm Richard D. Hall. I've had a great deal of very positive feedback about the previous programme, which attempted to lift the veil on WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. I will be discussing the feedback, which contains some very insightful comments, in a future show. I've also had people asking about the appeal I launched requesting first-hand witnesses to the Manchester attack in March to come forward with their accounts. Let's just say, based on the witnesses that have come forward so far, there is no evidence from witnesses contacting me that a large explosion killed 23 people. If you know a first-hand witness, please ask them if they would like to be interviewed to give their account on camera. Hopefully, I will update on this issue later in the series. As you will know, Andrew Johnson is a regular commentator on the show who researches many areas without being paid, purely out of his own thirst for knowledge and understanding of the kinds of subjects we discuss on Rich Planet. Some viewers have commented on Andrew's blue fleece and yellow t-shirt. One viewer said, "Has Andrew Johnson got an addiction to that f***ing rotten blue thing he always wears? He has been seen to wear that shitty blue top on your show for years now. Surely there's a Primark local to where he lives. P.S. I see he's obviously bought an iron since the last outing. Sheesh, whatever next." Unfortunately, we have already recorded 3 more shows featuring the blue fleece, so I'm afraid nothing can be done about it until later shows. As many will know, Rich Planet started out dedicated to the subject of UFOs, and viewers often ask for more shows covering this subject. So today's show is dedicated primarily to this much misunderstood topic. Later I will be talking about my film UFOs and NATO. If you haven't seen the film, please watch it to get the background to what I will be showing in today's lecture. There is considerable new information about a military facility on the Brecon Beacons in South Wales, which may be being used to track and possibly intercept UFOs. All this is explained later in the show. At the end of the lecture, I suggest that the Apollo missions did not get past low Earth orbit. Now, I'll be covering this in detail in a separate show later in the series. I have some new analysis on the Apollo program that I think everyone will be interested in, which is quite damning in my opinion. That follows in a later show. Now, on with the show featuring the man in the shitty blue thing. Now, many of you may have heard of Lloyd Pye, who died in 2013. I met him in 2010, and I interviewed him then about his work on human origins and also what is known as the Starchild Skull. Now, there's been some recent developments with regards to Lloyd Pye's work, and here to tell us about them again is Andrew Johnson. Thanks for coming in, Andrew, and there's good news and bad news, I guess.
Right, yeah, well, thanks very much for giving me the opportunity to give the update, Richard. I appreciate that, because this is something I've been interested in for over 10 years now. In fact, I met Lloyd for the first time in 2004, and I think one of the times we recently spent together was when we went to the Swansea group, where I gave the talk about the Starchild Skull earlier in 2017. And so I've been keeping up with any developments. I've tried to keep abreast of them. And just to give people a summary of what the skull is and why we think it's so important, I actually ended up getting a replica, which is on my left here, and this is what the skull looks like.
So just to point out, Andrew, because of the people who don't know about this, the white skull is a normal human skull, and that's why you've got that skull there, because you're comparing it to this skull with all of these anomalies.
Correct. Now this, as you said, this skull that I've got now in my left hand is anatomically accurate. It's just, it's a reproduction skull made out of plastic. Got it off eBay. But, just a side-by-side comparison, you can see some unusual features. Now, I'll probably mention a couple of these here, but there is a video online called Starchild for Dummies, which Lloyd Pye recorded, I think, around about 2012 sort of time, and he covers the main details of why this skull is so interesting.
Hi, I'm Lloyd Pye. For the past 13 years, I've worked with doctors, geneticists, and other scientific experts trying to solve one of the world's great mysteries. The Starchild skull is an actual bone skull that has virtually nothing in common with a human skull. It was discovered around 1930 in a mine tunnel in the Copper Canyon region of Mexico, beside a human female skull we use for comparison. Carbon-14 dating confirms that both died about 900 years ago. The Starchild skull's physical traits and its genetic structure are so extensively different from a normal human, at a bare minimum it will be considered a new species and potentially even an extraterrestrial alien. Since 1999, our goal has been to answer two astonishing questions about it. What on earth is the Starchild skull, and is it even from Earth? Many amateurs and credentialed professionals insist the Starchild skull was a human that suffered an extreme illness or deformity. Other experts discount that because they, unlike most critics, actually examine the skull. Those hands-on experts overwhelmingly agree the Starchild is completely unique and it does not fit the known profiles for any genetic variation or congenital defect. A common misconception about deformity is that genetic variation can produce any kind of physical alteration. This is wrong because survival past conception depends on genetic variations that fall within very narrowly defined parameters. Extensive physical and/or genetic variations are always fatal, and in the Starchild's case, we know from partial DNA recoveries that its genome contains vastly more genetic variations than any human could possibly survive. Despite our best efforts to present the truth about the Starchild, misinformation persists on the internet, including allegations that DNA recoveries have shown it to be 100% human, that its flat rear was caused by cradle boarding or some other cranial binding, that the expanded parietal bones at its sides were caused by hydrocephaly, and that its general weirdness was caused by progeria. Cradle boarding was a widespread practice in primitive cultures around the world. Infants would be swaddled onto a board carried on their mother's back as she did her daily work. To support their weak necks, infants' heads were loosely strapped down. Extensive resting of the rear of the head against the cradle board slowly deformed the soft skull bones until they were as flat as the board. A perfect example of cradle boarding is the human female found with the Starchild. The rear of her skull is bored flat from the top of the crown to just above the inion, the knob of bone at the lower rear of every human's head, where neck muscles attach to our skulls and prevent further flattening. In contrast, the Starchild skull has no inion, and its flattening extends well past where its inion should be. Also, any method of artificially shaping infant skulls leaves unmistakable evidence on their soft bones, and no such evidence is found on the Starchild's clearly convoluted bones, as observed by Dr. Ted Robinson. In addition, if the Starchild had ever been cradle-boarded, even once, the angle of the skull's downward tilt would be so extreme it would have choked to death in minutes and never would have reached adulthood, which we know it did. Therefore, no smooth flattening plus no choking hazard equals the Starchild was not cradle-boarded. Another misguided explanation that tries to account for the Starchild's physical anomalies centers on the bulging parietal bones at the sides of its head. Skeptics insist those must result from hydrocephaly, which causes excess spinal fluid to collect in or around the brain, which expands the skull uniformly, like a balloon. The first areas to expand are the suture lines, created by the disconnected edges of several bone plates that comprise an infant's skull, and which gradually close during its first 2 years to eventually fit together like puzzle pieces. In the Starchild skull, all of its sutures join normally, with no signs of separation, which by itself rules out any form of hydrocephaly. In addition, notice that a three-way junction of sutures actually dips inward. Could a balloon be blown up with a crease on its surface? No, and neither could the Starchild, unless its three-way plate junction was fused solid rather than closed normally. This is a standard CAT scan showing none of its cranial sutures were fused, a fact Dr. John Baczynski, a radiology expert, confirms. An inward crease plus no fused sutures equals the Starchild did not have hydrocephaly. The most recent favorite among skeptics trying to explain away the Starchild is progeria, a highly complex, inevitably fatal condition that causes infants to grow old at an extremely accelerated rate. Hopeful critics point out that one of the Starchild's projected facial features, its greatly reduced lower face, is similar to the facial reduction seen in progeria victims. However, the skulls of progeria victims are innately human, while the Starchild is not. There is no way to fit the Starchild skull into the head of a progeria victim because their physiognomy is so different. Another progeria symptom found in the Starchild is thin bone, but the similarity ends there. As progeria thins out its victims' bones, it greatly weakens them, whereas the Starchild's thin bone is 2 or 3 times harder than normal human bone. In fact, biochemically, it's more like human tooth enamel. Also, in progeria victims, the fontanelle, the soft spot at the top of the head, nearly always remains open until death, while the Starchild's is clearly closed. So, extremely hard bone plus a closed fontanelle equals the Starchild did not have progeria. 13 years of struggle to decipher the riddle of the Starchild skull make clear that nothing about it is simple or easy. Yet today we know several things about it with a high degree of certainty. It did not miraculously survive massive DNA disruptions that would kill any normal human shortly after conception. Its head was not cradle-boarded, it did not suffer from hydrocephaly or any other congenital defect, and it most clearly did not suffer from progeria. With those issues settled, let's turn to DNA. In the Starchild's case, 3 rounds of DNA testing have occurred. One was in 1999, the Stone Age of DNA testing, which concluded that the Starchild was a human male. 4 years later, in 2003, that original test was thoroughly discredited by a far more sophisticated series of tests that indicated the Starchild was a hybrid being with a human mother and a non-human father. Finally, in 2010 and 2011, state-of-the-art tests have shown that both of the earlier tests produced flawed results because the Starchild's DNA was much too unusual to be handled by those antiquated procedures. Despite the latest test results, people frequently tell me they've heard or read that the Starchild's DNA was proved to be 100% human. Critics doggedly insist the earlier results provide reliable confirmation that the Starchild is human. This gross factual error is widely dispersed across the internet because skeptics wrongly believe that if any sample of unknown DNA has any part that resembles human DNA, the sample is automatically from a human. This isn't just wrong, it's absurdly wrong. Human DNA is widely shared with dozens of other species. Chimps share 97% of their genome with humans. Gorillas, 95%. Rats, 70%. Mice, 65%. And even fruit flies share 60%. Therefore, a few strings of base pairs of Starchild DNA that happen to match human DNA does not mean it's entirely human, not by a mile. One absolute truth that everybody everywhere can count on is that no DNA recovered from the Starchild thus far actually proves it is 100% human. To grasp the basics of this debate, we need to understand that all humans have 2 types of DNA. Nuclear DNA comes from both parents and gives us our individuality. Mitochondrial DNA comes from our mothers only, and it allows each of us to be compared to other humans who share certain genetic affinities. The initial recovery of the Starchild's nuclear DNA produced several dozen fragments containing more than 30,000 base pairs, the steps in the twisted ladder of DNA. In half of those fragments, the base pairs could be matched exactly to similar fragments in the human genome. However, the other half could not be matched to any currently known species. These results are preliminary, requiring much repetitive testing for absolute verification. And if they were the only unusual results, they would be interesting but not totally compelling. However, they're far from the only unusual results. In humans, the 16,569 base pairs in our mitochondrial DNA carry a specific upper limit of variations, 120. Thus, every human has 120 or fewer variations in their mitochondrial DNA. Neanderthals have around 200 variations. The new prehuman, Denisovans, have 385. For every species, these numbers are solidly established, and they change extremely slowly over very long periods of time. With the Starchild's mitochondrial DNA, 4 recovered fragments add up to 9.5% of the human total. They contain 93 base pair variations. If we extrapolate 93 out to 100%, it creates a statistically acceptable bracket of 800 to 1,000 base pair differences in the Starchild compared to a human's 120 maximum. Thus, these two genomes cannot remotely be related. They're apples and lemons. Moving the Starchild even farther from humans is the recent recovery of a 211 base pair fragment recovered from the Starchild's FOXP2 gene. In humans, the FOXP2 gene is essential for formation of our brains, numerous internal organs, and our ability to speak. This all-important gene contains 2,594 base pairs, and in every normal human, each of those base pairs is absolutely identical. Here in blue, we see the 211 base pair fragment of human FOXP2 compared to the Starchild's fragment in black, along with fragments of several other species. The key things to notice here are the red letters among the Starchild's fragment, each of which denotes a single base pair variation. There are 56. Remember, normal humans have no variations in their entire FOXP2 gene, and certainly none in the 211 base pair fragment found in the Starchild. But rhesus monkeys do have 2 such variations: mice 20, dogs 27, elephants 21, opossums 21, frogs 26. And then we have the Starchild's towering 56. Remember, this FOXP2 result, like the previous 2, is partial. All 3 require additional DNA testing to establish absolute confirmation. Yet because all 3 are so highly anomalous relative to normal humans, we can be confident they will prove the Starchild's genome bears no relation to the human genome. Apart from DNA, we have physical evidence that confirms the Starchild is not human. If we consider 25 tangible points of reference on the human skull and the Starchild skull, not a single match can be found, not one. Even more remarkable is that some of those variations are unprecedented on Earth. The human eye socket is 2 inches deep, while the Starchild's is only 1/2 inch deep, a 75% reduction with a completely altered shape. Human eye sockets can have noticeable depth reductions if they have abnormal fusions in their cranial sutures, but a CAT scan has revealed that the Starchild did not have any fused sutures. Also, every astronaut who has spent more than a month in space acquired small but measurable reductions in the depth of their eye sockets. All humans have a brow ridge, which the Starchild lacks. Its brain is 1/3 larger than a human of its size. What should be 1,200 cubic centimeters is in fact 1,600. It has no frontal sinuses, another key aspect of human speech. A human skull balances at 2/3 toward its rear, behind the center of its neck. The Starchild skull balances at its center of cranial volume, directly above the center of its neck, which is much smaller than a human neck and oval rather than circular. In humans, the cerebellum in the blue circle is securely tucked into the curve at the rear of the skull. In the Starchild, its extra brain mass presses down at a steep angle that would squeeze a human brain out of the foramen magnum, the hole where the spine enters the skull. This has led some experts to speculate that the Starchild's brain might well be made of a denser material than human brains. The Starchild had very small cheekbones and correspondingly small chewing muscles. A fragment of the Starchild's maxilla, its upper jaw, reveals a mouth the size of an infant's that contained a full set of adult teeth, although only 2 remained intact. Those 2 teeth were worn to an extent not possible for a child, and also seem unlikely in an adult with such reduced chewing capacity due to its greatly reduced chewing muscles. This has led to speculation that the Starchild might possibly grow multiple sets of teeth during a greatly expanded lifetime. On the surface of human bone are many small pits called lacunae, which are an essential factor in the biological functioning of all vertebrate bone. Yet the Starchild bone contains no lacunae. Also, the Starchild's bone is much thinner than human bone, but it is much more durable. One reason for that durability is seen in magnified cross-sections, which show that microscopic fibers have successfully resisted a cutting blade. These fibers are embedded in the Starchild's bone like the steel rebar that reinforces concrete. Mycologists have ruled out fungi, moles, yeast, and bacteria. These fibers are a natural part of the Starchild's bone, and nothing like them has ever been found in any other bone from any other creature on Earth. Another discovery unique to the Starchild is a reddish residue in its cancellous holes. This is not bone marrow, which in all species is consumed by bacteria after death. Whatever this residue is, it resisted the natural organisms that consume post-mortem tissue, which makes it too one of a kind on Earth. Altogether, the extensive physical evidence we've gathered combines with the compelling DNA evidence to strongly indicate the Starchild skull is not from a human, and it may well be from beyond Earth. However, to prove that radical claim to a level no critic or skeptic can challenge, we have to secure a complete genome recovery. When we do that, it will be one of the greatest milestones in human history. Unfortunately, no endeavor of such size and importance can be completed without support. If you have found this video compelling and would like to help us by spreading the word about it, or in some other more direct way, please visit starchildproject.com.
Basically, Lloyd spent a long time researching the skull. It was given to him by the owner, Melanie Young. You know, we do have a story of how the skull came into Melanie Young's possession. It was found in a cave in 1930 in Mexico. Eventually came into the possession of a lady called Melanie Young.
And it's been carbon dated to be about 900 years old.
Right. So we've got that information. It's also been DNA tested, and I think you covered that in some of your interviews with Lloyd, didn't you? In part. And the DNA is very unusual, without going into the details. So what DNA has been recovered, again, suggests very strongly that this is very unusual in terms of it doesn't look like a human DNA. It's only got some vague similarities. But the reason why I wanted to mention it here was because those that have followed Rich Planet and they followed Lloyd Pye need to be aware of a development which happened in March 2016 when the skull's owner, Melanie Young, was interviewed by Mel Fabregas on the Veritas show, and I've got a recording of this interview. You can access the first hour free, and the second hour is behind a paywall for subscribers. But in the first hour, Melanie Young, who actually gave the skull to Lloyd Pye in 1999 or 1998, I think it was 1998 actually, she gave him the skull to do an investigation.
Just one other point. Andrew has a replica here of the skull. That's not the skull.
No, correct.
The actual skull has little pieces missing where DNA testing has been done and that kind of thing.
That's correct.
So she has that skull.
She does. Right,
so carry on.
And so she came out, and I have a recording of Melanie Young from a documentary called UFO Hunters, 2009. And she actually says in this documentary that she can't explain what the skull is. It's not the skull of a hydrocephalic child, which again, if you go to Wikipedia, put in Starchild Skull into Wikipedia, it'll say it's a deformed human skull from a child that suffered from hydrocephaly. She never agreed with that explanation, or she didn't in 2009, and that was one of the reasons why she gave it to Lloyd Pye, who was a specialist in hominids and hominoids and morphology of the human skeleton and human bones and so forth. That was one of the reasons she gave it to him to do an investigation, because he was independent, he wasn't associated with the university, but he did take the skull to various university professors and people in the academic community to get it studied. But then in this interview, which was given, as I say, March 2017, she is now saying that Lloyd Pye has not put out the correct information, and that Lloyd Pye persuaded Melanie Young that the skull wasn't that of a hydrocephalic child. And she then goes on to essentially say that Lloyd Pye was just in it for the money. He was trying to, get lots of money to get the skull, to make him famous and make a film about it. And of course, some of this is sort of partly true from certainly one angle, like they were trying to make a documentary about the skull, which was going to, have a sizable budget. But the fact that Lloyd was going to make money off of it, this is ridiculous. I mean, he was doing this for 14 years, didn't earn any money off it. He had it on a low income, almost living hand to mouth with this. So that and then they basically spend an hour up to 2 hours saying that what Lloyd did was no good. And I've written an article about this on my website, which has got all the details in for those that want to find out the story of the Starchild Skull and these latest developments. And the story is called Starchild Skull, Keeping the Record Straight. And that's on my website, checktheevidence.com. It's got a link to this video, so if you've never heard about the skull before, which I appreciate, some viewers might be thinking, what's going on here? I don't really understand this. Please watch the 17-minute video, watch the lecture from 2012 that Lloyd gave about the Starchild Skull and its history. All the information is in there that you need to know. And these very peculiar developments, I was shocked because 2014, Melanie Young, the owner, she gave a lecture which was essentially the same as one given by Lloyd Pye in 2012. It had all the same information.
So just to summarise briefly, Lloyd's conclusions at the point he was at before he died is that the DNA from this creature, whatever it is, cannot be found in the database that they keep for not just humans, the DNA database for all animals on Earth. It's not similar to anything. So who's right in this argument boils down to DNA testing, doesn't it?
Yes.
And he was getting more and more as time went on, but the company testing it didn't want to put their name to it because it was so controversial.
Correct.
If it was something doesn't originate from Earth, they might not want to put their name to that.
Correct. I mean, the guy that was doing the research had the permission of his company to do it, but they told him that we don't want our name connected to this research, but we're permitting you to do it in your spare time. So he was given permission. And then this latest attempt, which is essentially a debunking attempt, and it's been published by a researcher called Chase Kloetsky. And she's published this report, which apparently has taken a year to produce, which basically puts at the bottom line that this skull is the skull of a human child, a 5-year-old child. And Melanie Young essentially, says that this is correct, despite her having disagreed with this conclusion when she was involved with Lloyd Pye.
Right. And are they claiming to have done a full genome sequence?
To my knowledge, the latest test is no different to the one they did in 2003 as regards the genome test. They'd done a very similar test to the 2003 test, and they said that nuclear DNA is recoverable, but they didn't recover it for this particular test. So they haven't sequenced the entire genome. That would be very expensive. So they've debunked the skull using the same evidence that Lloyd had used to say that, it was not the skull of any type of human primate or anything like that. But as I say, it's quite complicated.
Yeah.
We don't have time to cover it here, really. I wanted to alert people that are interested to this development because I think it's part of a wider debunking campaign. I think there's something going on within the UFO community to try and take control of any of the more serious research and try and run it into a ditch, as we might say, discredit it. And I think we've seen this happening with the Rendlesham case, which you and I have discussed separately. And then there's various signs that I think larger groups are trying to take over some areas of UFO research and things like this, the Starchild Skull and some other areas, to kind of water it down and debunk it. That's what I think this is part of, and that's why I wanted to bring it to people's attention.
Yeah. My thoughts on the skull are what may have happened because Lloyd wanted money for DNA testing, and in the, I don't know what year it was, but he got what, £18,000, something like that. I don't know the exact figure, from a source, and he was able to do some DNA testing. Now, I'm not going to mention that source, but
Lloyd mentions that source in his lectures, but so people can find out who that is.
Now, what the absolute source of that money was, I'm not really sure. But is it the case that perhaps somebody in the black world really wanted to know what he had hold of, and therefore he was given some money to do some limited DNA testing, and then at some point they realised what they had on their hands, and realising that if Lloyd had kept going on his journey, he would have eventually got a full genome sequence, and he would have been able to prove that that thing doesn't fit into anything on the Earth. And they've then got the smoking gun on their hands.
Well,
so,
I think there is an element of that, yes.
So was Lloyd finished off?
Well, some people have argued that. I mean, Lloyd himself, if you go back and read his Facebook post from the time, he didn't think he didn't think that he'd been targeted with cancer. But you know, we just don't know. But the actual DNA evidence that was recovered and was tested, I feel from what Lloyd has said, the way that he'd reported it, was pretty much to me conclusive that this skull was not from around here.
Now the problem is that the company that he was using for that DNA analysis, well, we don't know who it was.
Correct. And they've made a big thing of this with this latest article and study posted by Melanie Young. They're claiming that scientists have put their name to it to say that it's a human skull. Therefore, that validates the conclusion that it's a human skull. But this, again, is untrue if you read the article that I posted, because for many years on the Starchild Project's website, over 10 years, we've had a number of medical experts that have put their name to the study of this, not in relation to the DNA, but the physiology of it, which says they've looked at it and they can't match it up with anything that's human. One of those people is Dr. Ted Robinson, and there are about 10 other scientists that have put their names to it, said, yes, we've looked at this skull, we've analysed it, it's nothing like any other human skull that we've seen, and we can't explain any of its features in any sensible way. You know, so the Melanie Young herself has now tried to refute all of those statements with this latest thing that she's posted, which is an extremely odd way of doing things. When you give a skull to somebody to investigate, they have it for 14 years, and then you then publish a study after that debunking the previous...
after they've died.
Yeah, after they've died, attempting to debunk the previous 14 years of research. I mean, if that doesn't seem an odd way of doing things to people, then, you know, I don't know what is. All
right. So now Lloyd's written various books on human origins, because really this started off as a sideline for him. His core area was human origins and how did man come to be in his present form?
Correct.
Which is quite a controversial subject if you look at it. Obviously, we have the theory of evolution, and we've also got the theory of creationism. And Lloyd Pye really didn't agree with either of those absolute theories. He was more of the mind that there were sudden overhauls of the hominids.
Anthropology says that we evolved from a common ancestor with chimps between 5 and 8 million years ago. Somewhere in there was a common ancestor, and humans and chimps branched into their separate species of today. That's what anthropology and zoology and all of that says. However, when geneticists in the middle 1980s began to look at mitochondrial DNA and clocking it backwards, because they feel that it's something that can give them a timeline on humanity. When they did that, they found that we were about 200,000 years old, not between 8 and 5 million, only 200,000. So that's where our species begins as we are now, as we are today. So science then was in a real quandary, because the anthropologists and the geneticists just did not agree on this timeline. So an answer had to be devised to explain away what the geneticists had found and still keep the idea of evolution intact. So what they came up with was what's called the bottleneck, the genetic bottleneck, in which they say sometime prior to 200,000 years ago, all of humankind up to that point in the world was decimated by some unknown kind of catastrophe, leaving only a few breeding pair alive, and those few breeding pair happened to be within reach of each other, so they could continue to have sex and procreate. So that's just,
Yeah.
it's an impossible scenario.
So if we draw a tree, branches of a tree, which is mankind sort of spreading his genes and spreading the race, it goes back to a point, and that point is between 200 and 300,000 years ago, and everyone agrees on that.
Right.
But what they don't agree on is whether that was the absolute start, or whether there was some other link to. It's actually one branch off another larger branch.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And the argument is, did we in fact begin completely wholly at that point, or did we squeeze through that bottleneck, and prior to that we were something else, but we were very close enough to human, so that while all of them died out, all that were left were still pretty much the same thing.
Now, that said, you put forward the argument that at that point in time, when the start of that tree, that was the start, that there wasn't this link.
Right. I contend that at 200,000 years ago, we were we were the result of genetic engineering over the course of some particular length of time. I don't know, really can't say how much, but the end product of that genetic engineering is us. And they get the final product around 200,000 years ago, and it begins to spread from that point.
And I believe one of the lines of argument that you use to try and make that point is the fact that our genetic code has errors in it, which other species doesn't.
Right. Species can have genetic flaws, genetic defects. That's not an issue. They don't have nearly as many as we do. We have over 4,000 and counting genetic defects in our gene pool. So if we have a 200,000-year-old gene pool, how do you get 4,000 plus genetic defects? It's just implausible.
Now, when you use the word genetic defect, people will think, oh, someone with an extra finger or something like that.
No, I mean, by genetic defect, there are any number of genetic disorders. Down syndrome is a very common one. Spina bifida is one that everybody knows about. Right. Tay-Sachs disease. There's just lots of them.
Right.
And any one of those 4,000 can show up in any couple, because each of us carry about 200 of those 4,000 in our gene code. Now, in other words, not every person walks around with 4,000 genetic disorders. We walk around with about 200 each, but collectively in the gene pool itself, there are over 4,000. So it's a function of who you and your partner, when you have children, your 200 approximately disorders, and then whether or not any of your children are going to express any of those.
So what would that figure be in chimps, Lloyd? That equivalent
it would
number?
be considerably less. I mean, chimps, for example, gorillas, alligators. I mean, a lot of species have, for example, the genetic defect that causes albinism, causes albinos. So you can have albino chimps, albino gorillas, albino humans, albino alligators, albino birds, a lot of things, all right? So, but that doesn't kill you. That just makes you an albino. It doesn't kill you. So that passes on, you see. But with humans, there are a couple of dozen of our genetic defects that kill you early on, so before you reach puberty, so that you can't possibly have passed it on. So where do these come from, and then how do they get passed into the whole gene pool?
So it's suggesting that it's been messed with, basically.
There's that evidence, and then there's just the physical evidence of our genome showing very clearly that the second and third chromosome in humans that is in primates has been fused. I mean, genetically fused, so that its telomeres on its ends are cut off of the second and the third, and they've been put together in such a way that they still function. And that's extremely unlikely to have occurred naturally. Now, science says, yes, it does, but really it doesn't.
Because human beings have 46 chromosomes, all other primates have 48, am I right on that?
Well, the higher primates, yeah,
not
the lower primates.
So if we've evolved from them, then at some point we would have dropped or fused those. So you would presume, if you go by the theory of this this link, that was when the chromosome must have been dropped.
Exactly. When the two chromosomes were fused, it would be in the time leading up to the actual creation of human beings as we are today.
Right.
Yes.
Now, even if we accept the fact that we all came from this theoretical or actual Eve, which was, let's say it was 200,000 years ago, the anthropologists will say, well, yes, but the population went down to 1 or 2, but they actually evolved from apes. So therefore, if their theory is correct, there has to be an infinite number of, going by Darwinian evolution, an infinite number of adjustments from, say, 8 million years ago to now, through that, even down through that tree that we call it.
Exactly.
But you've looked at that, the evidence of bones, or either
Right.
fossils or bones, to see whether the anthropological things that people dig up suggest that there is a linear path from, say, 8 million years ago to now.
Right.
What would you say on that?
Well, there is no linear path. There is no linear path anywhere in anthropology. Science tries to pretend that there is, but all you have to do is read a book called Icons of Evolution, and you find out how flawed and how much fraud is involved in that, the mainstream science. But as far as the human, pre-human fossil record, what is called the pre-human fossil record, you have two main groups. You have the Australopithecines, and then you have the early Homos. And the Australopithecines seem to lead into and overlap somewhat the early Homos at around 2 million years ago. Up to there, the Australopithecines are very ape-like looking. They have very, very ape-like heads. Then with the early Homos, it does have a more human-like head. The early Australopithecines have these big, wide cheekbones, and very different than what we have. So in the early Homos, the cheekbones are down. So there's a real transition point at about 2 million years ago. Something happens, and what existed before is modified into something, and very dramatically too. It isn't. There's no gradualism, no Darwinism, any of that. And then suddenly you have Homos looking very different. But nonetheless, they are still very primate looking. They have big round night vision eyes. They have widely splayed noses that probably go, their nasal openings, noses flat across their face. They have mouths that stick off their face in the primate prognathous fashion. They have no chins. They have foreheads. They have big heavy brow ridges. They have foreheads that go back from those brow ridges. So they, in every way, for the next 2 million years, up to Cro-Magnons, you have that particular look with the brains growing bigger. So there's no evolution there. There's no change. It's dramatic overhauls, like overnight.
So there's no gradual set of skulls where the brow ridges gradually diminish to what we have.
That collectively science calls the missing link. And they just keep insisting that they're going to find the missing link someday, because it has to be there for their theory to be true. But in fact, there is no missing link. They haven't ever found one, and they're not going to find one. They keep saying they do, but they never do.
It's a theory in between the two argued theories that you hear about in mainstream, which is creationism and Darwinism. And Lloyd wrote this book in 98 called Everything You Know Is Wrong.
That's right, Richard. I mean, he rightly points out, for example, that in the mainstream, they started off with the theory of evolution, where you've got this idea that, we're all, as I've said to you in previous conversations, we are all slime plus time. We started off as a form of slime that then over millions and hundreds and thousands of millions of years, we've evolved into Homo sapiens just naturally with nothing, it's just a sort of chemical and biological process that happens naturally after a planet's formed, and that's all there is to it. But then this idea of one species changing into another, like, fish growing legs and walking out of water, if you try and trace that, you can only find certain points in that journey. You can't find a continuous line. There's always jumps in that. And the mainstream have now acknowledged that. They acknowledge that. I mean, even when I was in my teams, they call it punctuated equilibrium.
Right.
That is the name that's used in mainstream to try and say, oh yes, that's the name for this observation. A chimp hasn't turned into a human being, but we can look at chimps, we can see they're very close to human beings, therefore human beings must have evolved from chimpanzees. That's the kind of way that it works in the mainstream.
Right. There's the whole question of how man in his current form, Cro-Magnon some people call it, came to be. What was it just a very gradual change from an earlier hominid, or was there a sudden change either through a hybridization process or genetic engineering process, which Lloyd Pye
That's what he
contends.
discusses in here. Yeah, absolutely.
But then in his other book, he goes right the way back to 4 billion years to how the Earth itself evolved, and that there was possibly intervention, as he calls it, that it wasn't a process left to its own devices. There must have been an external influence which created the atmosphere, and then this, and then several. Your creationists say, well, you're talking about God, Richard, aren't you?
That's right.
But he wasn't talking about God in that sense, was he?
But he has explored some of the similar territory to the creationists, and he's had some of the same sorts of arguments with the Darwinists as the creationists have. So he shares some common sort of statements with them, but he's not talking about creationism.
Well, the book is divided into 4 parts, as we talked about last time. In part 1, I go over Darwinism mostly, not so much creationism. If you believe, you believe. You're not subject to argument very much if you're a creationist. So I go after what the Darwinists say, and I show how that, in fact, they don't explain either how life came to be here or how particularly we came to be here. The evidence that they have is contingent on something called macroevolution, which is species into species. There's really no evidence for that. The creationists do make that argument, and I think they make it accurately. There is absolutely no evidence anywhere of true macroevolution, species into species. We have changing body parts, which is called microevolution. Darwinists take the microevolution and they extrapolate. They say, well, if you can have change in parts, you can have changes in the whole bodies. That's what Darwin himself said. Actually, the truth of it is, though it seems logical, it's not borne out anywhere in the record.
But yeah, this is the original book, Everything You Know Is Wrong, and it's very hard to get hold of copies of this now, and I think they're sort of running for, going for quite high prices on Amazon, eBay and places. And this does cover some of the earlier bits of evolution, but like as Richard was saying, it's more focused on the hominids and hominoids. And by hominid, we mean something that's bipedal. It's sort of superficially human-looking. It primarily walks on 2 legs, but it's not in the acknowledged evolutionary line back to primates, which has allegedly evolved into humans, according to the mainstream. So hominid is a separate branch of humans, and they claim that there are these separate branches based on various criteria, some of which are discussed in this book. Mm-hmm. So what's happened recently, and why I wanted to bring this up in relation to the skulls and everything, is that I was very recently contacted by Amy Vickers, because she has been working on this book for 2 or 3 years, which is an updated version of Everything You Know Is Wrong, and she's given it the title of Everything You Know Is Still Wrong, which I rather like. And so this will be becoming available in about August, so it's not available yet, August 2017. We're recording in July 2017. So this has a lot of information about an alternative story about how we got to be as we are today, and as we've just discussed there, some of the issues about chimpanzees and the genetics of chimpanzees, and it also talks about the Bigfoot mystery. Bigfoot is an example of a hominid. Bigfoot isn't a type of human, but it sort of looks human because it's bipedal, it appears to be intelligent, it has hair all over its body, so it appears to be a type of ape, but it's not a type of ape, it's different to an ape, because apes and chimpanzees don't regularly walk on 2 legs, whereas Bigfoot does. So Lloyd goes into all of that in this book, and Amy has put this together following Lloyd's death because there was various draft copies of notes that he'd been working on, and she decided to take it upon herself to produce this new edition. So I just wanted to recommend that as a good read for people who want to get a hold of it and find out some of the lies we've been told about our evolution or lack of evolution.
Okay, and just to finish by saying that in all of these areas, Andrew, with regards to the skull and with regards to Everything You Know Is Wrong, we have not had time to put forward 1% of all of the information in this short interview, right? If you're going to sit there and refute what we're talking about, you need to read the book or you need to watch the lectures by Lloyd Pye before you come to an opinion. Because if you come to an opinion just watching this interview, it's an ill-informed opinion.
Absolutely.
And don't write it off until you've actually studied the information.
Yes.
Because it will make you think.
Absolutely, and there are a number of lectures given by Lloyd, and there is also his website, lloydpye.com. He's got some essays on there. That is in the process of being updated and revised because there's a few broken links on there and stuff. So yeah, so review the information first before you criticise it. You know, don't just assume that it must be nonsense because you've never heard anything about it.
Okay, and you haven't got your hands on any piece of the original skull then?
No,
Lloyd didn't cut a few bits off just in case? Or
no, because the skull belongs to Melanie Young, and so it's always been in her possession. And curiously, in this interview, going back to the interview, she tried to sort of make, she tried to make inferences that Lloyd had stolen it from her, when that is not true. She gave it to him. You know, so
right.
And he gave it back to her as well in about 2003. I think she was given the skull back.
So one thing that would possibly settle the argument is if the DNA sequencing company, because you kept that quiet because they would only do the sequencing if he didn't reveal the guy's name who was helping him and the name of the company, because they didn't want to be attached to such research.
Correct.
So if we can find the name of that person who did the sequencing on the Fox and found out about the FOXP2 gene, I mean, there's a lot of other data other than just the FOXP2 gene, right? But that would be a piece of evidence.
It would be very strong evidence if they could bring that forward publicly, and and write that up in a scientific paper and get it published in a journal, with all the names of the people involved. That would be ideal.
Yeah.
Whether that will happen, I think the likelihood of that happening is quite low at the moment, but who knows? Maybe we would see something like that if the researcher involved wanted to go that route. It would depend probably on his personal circumstances and how important he felt this was to put that on, that sort of information out.
Okay, all right. And if there's any developments on this, you'll let everyone know.
Yes, absolutely. You can keep an eye on Lloyd Pye's website, starchildproject.com. You could even go and look at Melanie Young's website if you really want to. And of course, I'm sure there'll be something that pops up on Rich Planet or on my website, checktheevidence.com. So.
Right. Okay, thanks, Andrew.
Thank you very much.
Coming up next is a section from my recent lecture covering new research regarding the alleged secret UFO tracking facility on the Brecon Beacons in South Wales. You might want to watch this film first to get some background.